The 18th century is often described as the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, a time when social and cultural change were guided by rational thought and scientific investigation. But late in that century and into the 19th, there were developments in Western culture, in music, literature, and the arts that are often called romantic. This reaction to rationalism included a belief in the superiority of beauty over the intellect, of emotion over reason, of nature over design, and of simplicity over complexity. It also tended to reject the preference for classical form and content, which we saw in the last lecture, in favor of what the Romantics saw as the authentic expressions of their own European cultures. All this made Romantic literature a natural location for writers and artists who wanted to freely express their imaginations. Not all Romantic works delved into the world of the fantastic. Some, like the groundbreaking novel The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was published by Johann Goethe in 1774, had very realistic setting, though their characters lived more extreme and melodramatic lives than most of us ever do. Werther, for example, wears a bright yellow vest and breeches, and in the end, he does away with himself, rather than face life without the woman he loves, who is married to someone else. But another type of Romantic literature consisted of collections of tales, like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood, which were set in mysterious or threatening places like dark forests, and the protagonists faced magical creatures like witches and sorcerers. Our modern collections of these stories, which became known as fairy tales, began with the work of the French author Charles Perrault, who published in 1697 a collection of folk tales intended for children. It was his idea to attribute these stories to Mother Goose, and he included versions of such now classic tales as Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, and Sleeping Beauty. Aside from his interest in guiding the upbringing of children through stories that taught moral lessons, Perrault had an ideological motivation. He was a leader of those French intellectuals who believed that the classical forms and themes which had dominated the Renaissance should now give way to the innovative creations of modern artists, writers, and thinkers. They also believed in drawing on their own languages and cultures rather than turning to epic poems and other works of the classical past, and in Perrault's case, in adding a religious and moral element which was sometimes absent from Greco-Roman literature. An equally important collection of modern fairy tales, which appeared early in the 19th century, was created by the brothers Grimm, who weren't children's authors at all, but scholars who wanted to preserve the various versions of traditional folk tales told by people across Germany, because they saw these tales as an important part of the country's traditional culture. Not only was their work not meant for children, but they included in one of their editions a warning to parents that some of the stories, which often included terrible violence, might not be appropriate for younger readers. For example, in the story The Juniper Tree, a woman deliberately decapitates her stepson, makes her young daughter believe that she is responsible for it, and to get rid of the evidence, she serves the boy up a stew, which his oblivious father completely devours. One of the brothers, Wilhelm, did eventually begin to write original stories which were intended for children. In addition to these fairy tales, there were also original works of romantic fiction that were based on fantastic scenarios. One early writer of fantasy was the German E.T.A. Hoffmann, who in the early 19th century wrote a number of stories that featured dream imagery and wild flights of the imagination. One of the most famous of these is The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Its heroine is a young girl whose toy Nutcracker comes alive. At the end of the story, he defeats the Mouse King, who wants to conquer the girl's bedroom and take all of her toys. He then marries the girl and brings her to the kingdom of dolls, where she becomes their queen. This is a theme we still find in fantasy, such as the Guillermo del Toro film Pan's Labyrinth, whose hero is a young girl who has forgotten she's actually a magical princess. Like the movie, Hoffmann's story was not intended for children, though it was adapted for them, and became one of the most popular Christmas stories. Another of Hoffmann's stories is closer to science fiction than to fantasy. It's about an automaton called the Talking Turk, which was based on an actual device built in 1770 that became famous for being able to play chess, but was in fact a fraud perpetrated on the European public. In another story, a young man falls in love with a woman who is introduced to him as the daughter of a professor he knows, but turns out to be a mechanism which the professor had built. The idea of a robot made in the form of an appealing woman has appeared not only in recent films like Ex Machina, but as far back as Fritz Lang's Metropolis in 1927. The most famous author of original tales from this period is, of course, Hans Christian Andersen, who in the mid-19th century wrote The Little Mermaid and many other stories. Andersen's project of telling stories to children was so successful that two of them later formed the basis of Disney movies, and a live-action film was made in 1952, in which Andersen, who was played by Danny Kaye, one of the warmest and most empathetic actors of his time, tells his stories to an audience of local children. Andersen's stories paint very vivid images. The beginning of The Little Mermaid, for example, describes the Sea King's castle. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral, and the long Gothic windows are of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl, which would be fit for the diadem of a queen. Andersen's style had already been anticipated by a German writer named Friedrich de la Motte Fouquet, who published in 1811 a novella about a mermaid-like creature called an Undine, who marries a knight so that she can gain a human soul. The story, which takes place many hundreds of years ago, contains magic, a romantic triangle, and a great deal of tragedy. It was made into an opera whose music was composed by Hoffmann, and it has been adapted to film as recently as 2020. An important subset of romantic fantasy literature, which developed in the late 18th century, is called Gothic, after a medieval architectural style which was characterized by a dark and moody atmosphere. Many of the stories set in this atmosphere actually do take place in castles or in other old or ruined buildings, and they evoke the sensation of what we now call horror or suspense, as in the works of Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft. Though some of E.T.A. Hoffmann's work may fall into this category, the first author to write a clearly Gothic novel was Horace Walpole, whose Castle of Otranto, published in 1764, takes place in the Middle Ages and features a haunted castle, a family curse, and many tragic deaths. But one of the most famous Gothic works of all is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818. Shelley's novel is full of spectacular landscapes, including a French glacier and the frozen Arctic, and both of its main characters suffer terrible psychological torment. Victor Frankenstein is driven to find a way to conquer death after his mother dies of scarlet fever while he is still a young man. And though the monster he creates is humane enough to save a girl from drowning and learns to read books including Milton's Paradise Lost, which we discussed in a recent installment, he grows angry when he is rejected by others and seeks revenge against Victor for failing to create a mate for him as he had promised to do. In the end, he kills Victor's brother, his friend, and his new wife, and finally, fleeing to the Arctic, he goes off at the novel's end to take his own life. As he tells the last person to speak with him, "Once my fancy was soothed with dreams of virtue, of fame, and of enjoyment. Once I falsely hoped to meet with beings who, pardoning my outward form, would love me for the excellent qualities which I was capable of unfolding. But now crime has degraded me beneath the meanest animal. When I run over the frightful catalogue of my sins, I cannot believe that I am the same creature whose thoughts were once filled with sublime and transcendent visions of the beauty and the majesty of goodness. But it is even so. The fallen angel becomes a malignant devil. Yet even that enemy of God and man had friends and associates in his desolation. I am alone." Though the book's tone is, on the whole, one of psychological horror and atmospheric dread. It also contains elements of scientific speculation. Victor's experiments in reanimation seem to have been inspired by Luigi Galvani's real-life researches into the relationship between electricity and living tissue, which makes the novel stand apart from the sorcery and magic that were typical of Gothic literature. But the fact that the novel is interested in scientific progress doesn't mean that it's entirely in favor of it. The tragic consequences of Victor's experiments placed it in the tradition of scientific novels that question the wisdom of playing God and challenging the natural order. And this fear of science experiments run amok has become so entrenched in modern culture that the 20th century sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov, who was himself a scientist, went out of his way to challenge it by creating robots which were gentle enough to win the affection of small children, and were made with a set of moral laws stricter than the ones their creators claimed to have. A few years later, Mary Shelley wrote another novel called The Last Man, whose protagonist is one of a few people to survive a plague which has broken out across the world. Though it's set at the end of the 21st century, the novel, like some of the Enlightenment works we looked at recently, only uses the future as a backdrop in which to create a fictional world, just as the distant past had once served the same purpose. And it's not futuristic in the sense of speculating about the sort of technological or social changes that might develop from the present state of things. Apart from the plague itself, the world is much the same. People travel by ship, and the main characters are members of the same noble class that existed in Shelley's time. There's even a war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, just as there was at the time the book was written. The one major change is that in the story, the British monarchy has just come to an end, and there are moves toward establishing a republican form of government like that in the United States. As in Frankenstein, the story has a scientific aspect, the spread of the disease and how it might be halted by medical science. But the novel is mainly concerned with the relationships among its main characters, who are a group of friends and lovers, and their efforts to survive as the plague spreads. Later in the 19th century, a number of novels applied a Gothic sensibility to stories set in modern cities rather than in dark forests and ruined castles. Bram Stoker's Dracula, for example, starts in those places, but then moves to the crowded and busy London of the author's time. Another author from this time was Oscar Wilde, who, like Hans Christian Andersen, wrote stories in the style of traditional folk tales, with talking animals and objects and various supernatural creatures. These stories, like Andersen's, are very picturesque. In one of them, The Happy Prince, a swallow describes his life in Egypt. "I am waited for in Egypt," said the swallow. "My friends are flying up and down the Nile and talking to the large lotus flowers. Soon they will go to sleep in the tomb of the great king. The king is there himself in his painted coffin. He is wrapped in yellow linen and embalmed with spices. Round his neck is a chain of pale green jade, and his hands are like withered leaves." But Oscar Wilde's most famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1891, is set in the fashionable London of the British aristocracy. Dorian is a beautiful and vain young man who sinks into despair after his portrait has been painted. "How sad it is! I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful, but this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way, if it were I who was to be always young, and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that." Though the idea of selling your soul to Satan has been common in Western culture, Wilde doesn't explicitly tell us that that is what Dorian is trying to do. If anything, he seems to be appealing to a sort of spirit or ideal of beauty, as Dorian's friend, Lord Henry, describes it. What happens to Dorian's picture suggests that there is some supernatural process at work here. As Dorian mistreats others, his picture grows not only older, but uglier. But this dynamic suggests that for Wilde, the soul is an expression of the human moral conscience rather than a gift from God. On the other hand, Lord Henry wonders whether the nature of the soul could be revealed through scientific research. Who could say where the fleshly impulse ceased or the psychical impulse began? How shallow were the arbitrary definitions of ordinary psychologists? He began to wonder whether we could ever make psychology so absolute a science that each little spring of life would be revealed to us. It was clear to him that the experimental method was the only method by which one could arrive at any scientific analysis of the passions. In one of the most scientifically minded Gothic novels of the period, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1886, the protagonist invents a chemical substance which separates what he calls the lower elements of his soul or nature from the higher ones. He does this in an effort to improve not his religious or moral state, but his psychological one. He wants not to do away with the evil side of his personality, but to end the painful struggle between his two halves, which all human beings have to face. As Hyde, he goes out into the dimly lit and dangerous streets of London to commit his crimes. But as Gothic protagonists often do, he soon finds his life spiraling out of control as he starts involuntarily turning into Hyde without first using the chemical. While Stevenson's notion of a multifaceted and conflicted mind is similar to what Freud would have to say about it several years later, his solution to the problem is physical rather than psychoanalytical. The substance that Jekyll invents is based upon a specific salt, but he discovers that it only works because it contains some unknown impurity, so when he tries to make more of it in order to change back, he's unsuccessful and must spend the rest of his life as Hyde. In our coming installments, we'll look at the beginnings of modern science fiction with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, modern horror with Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, and modern fantasy with L. Frank Baum and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Please remember to like and subscribe.